I invited my family to a luxurious Christmas dinner. On the day, they abandoned me and ate somewhere else together. I had dinner alone, crying, until my grandson walked into the restaurant and handed me an envelope. When I opened it, that key and DNA test changed everything. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I spent 3 days preparing for what I thought would be our first real Christmas dinner together in years. The reservation at Le Bernardin wasn't cheap, $800 for our table, but I didn't care. At 68, I'd learned that time with family is worth any price, or so I believed. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was trying so hard to bring together people who barely tolerated my presence the rest of the year. But Harold had been gone for 6 months now, and the holidays felt impossibly heavy without him. I needed my family around me, needed to feel like I still mattered to someone. I chose my outfit carefully that morning. The navy dress Harold always said brought out my eyes, the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 40th anniversary. My hands shook slightly as I fastened the clasp. I told myself it was excitement, not anxiety, but deep down I knew better. The calls started coming in around 3 o'clock, just as I was getting ready to leave for the restaurant. "Mom, I'm so sorry." Sarah's voice was sickeningly sweet through the phone. "Emma came down with something and we can't risk exposing everyone. You understand, right?" My daughter had perfected that tone over the years, the one that sounded caring but felt dismissive. Emma was my granddaughter, Sarah's youngest, and supposedly my pride and joy, though I hadn't seen her in months. "Of course, dear," I heard myself saying. "Is there anything I can do to help?" No, we'll be fine. Rain check? Rain check. As if family dinners were tennis matches to be rescheduled at convenience. 20 minutes later, my son Michael called. "Mom, listen, I'm stuck at the office. This deal is falling apart, and I need to stay and fix it. You know how it is." I knew how it was. Michael's deals were always more important than his mother. They had been for 30 years. "What about Jennifer and the kids?" I asked, referring to his wife and my other grandchildren. "They're actually helping Sarah with Emma. Trying to keep the kids occupied while she's sick." Something cold settled in my stomach. "They're all together?" A pause. "Well, yeah, but just for a few hours. Nothing planned or anything. Nothing planned. Right." The final call came from my youngest, David. His excuse was the most creative yet. His car had broken down and AAA couldn't get to him for hours. He was stranded, so sorry, maybe next time. I sat in my living room, still in my navy dress, staring at my phone. 3 children, 3 excuses, all delivered within an hour of each other. The coordination was almost impressive in its cruelty, but I'd already paid for the reservation. The dress was already on, and sitting alone in my apartment felt worse than sitting alone in public, so I drove to the restaurant anyway. Le Bernardin was everything I'd hoped it would be. Elegant, warm, buzzing with families celebrating together. The hostess looked at me with barely concealed pity as I explained that yes, it would just be me at the table for 6. "Would you prefer a smaller table?" she asked gently. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Leave it as it is." I ordered wine first, a bottle of the Bordeaux Harold used to love. The server didn't comment on the fact that I was clearly drinking alone, for which I was grateful. I ordered appetizers I couldn't afford, entrees I didn't want, trying to fill the enormous table with food since I couldn't fill it with people. The breaking point came when I saw a family at the next table, 3 generations laughing together, sharing stories, the grandmother clearly treasured at the center of it all. The tears started then, quiet at first, then impossible to stop. I was dabbing at my eyes with the cloth napkin when I heard running footsteps. Hugo burst through the restaurant doors, his 17-year-old face flushed from the cold and something else. Anger, maybe. Or determination. "Grandma Della!" His voice carried across the restaurant, and several diners looked up. He weaved between tables, ignoring the maitre d's protests, until he reached me. His dark hair was disheveled, his coat half-buttoned like he'd dressed in a hurry. "Hugo?" I stood up, confused. "What are you doing here? Aren't you with your mother and the others?" He was breathing hard, like he'd been running for blocks. In his hand was a manila envelope, thick and official-looking. His eyes were bright with tears he was trying not to shed. "I had to find you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I couldn't let them do this to you anymore." "Do what? Honey? What are you talking about?" He glanced around the restaurant, then back at the envelope in his hands. "They're all together, Grandma. At Romano's. 3 blocks from here. They've been planning this for weeks." My knees felt weak. I sank back into my chair. "Planning what?" Hugo's jaw clenched in a way that reminded me painfully of Harold when he was angry. "The dinner wasn't the real plan. They needed you out of the way tonight because—" He held up the envelope. "Because of this." I stared at the envelope like it might bite me. "What is it?" "It's from Grandpa Harold's lawyer. It came to Mom's house today." His voice dropped to a whisper. "It's his will, Grandma. And there's something else." He sat down heavily in the chair next to me, the one that should have been his mother's. "They made me come with them to Romano's, said it was a family meeting about taking care of Grandma Della's future. But when the lawyer started reading—" Hugo's hands were shaking now as he placed the envelope on the table between us. "Everything's yours, Grandma. The house upstate, the investments, everything. Grandpa left it all to you." The restaurant seemed to fade around us. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. But why would that upset everyone? I mean, I am his widow. Because they've been telling everyone, including me, that Grandpa was leaving most of it to them. Mom's been planning to renovate the upstate house. Uncle Michael was going to use the investments for his business. Uncle David was going to sell some of it to pay off his debts." My mouth went dry. "How long have they known about the will?" "Months," Hugo said quietly. "Maybe longer. But there's more, Grandma. There's something else in here they don't want you to see." He reached into the envelope and pulled out what looked like laboratory results. "It's a DNA test, Grandma. Grandpa had it done before he died." I took the papers with trembling hands, squinting at the scientific language I couldn't quite understand. But some things were clear enough. The test was comparing Hugo's DNA to my family's. "I don't understand," I whispered. Hugo's voice was barely audible now. "I'm not really your grandson, Grandma Della. I'm not Mom's biological son. She adopted me when I was 2, but she never told you the truth. She's been using me all these years to get money from you and Grandpa, pretending I was blood family." The papers fluttered from my hands to the floor. The wine glass tipped over, red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my life, was crumbling around me. But as I looked at Hugo, this boy who had run through the streets to find me, who had chosen truth over the lies that had sustained him for 15 years, I realized something else was beginning. Something that might, for the first time in years, be real. Hugo helped me to the restroom where I splashed cold water on my face and tried to process what he'd just told me. My reflection in the mirror looked older than my 68 years, the carefully applied makeup now streaked with tears. But my eyes looked different somehow, awake, maybe, for the first time in years. When we returned to the table, I made Hugo eat something while he told me the whole story. His voice was steady now, like he'd been holding this secret for so long that finally sharing it was a relief. "The lawyer's office was nothing like I expected," he began, picking at the breadbasket. "Mr. Peterson had this huge mahogany desk and all these legal books everywhere. Mom, Uncle Michael, and Uncle David were sitting there looking so confident, like they already knew what they were going to inherit." I poured myself another glass of wine, my hands steadier now. "How long have they known about the will reading?" "Mom got the call 3 weeks ago. She made this whole production about how sad it was that we had to deal with Grandpa's affairs, but I could tell she was excited. She kept talking about what we could do with the upstate house, how it needed updating, how we could make it into something really special. The upstate house. Harold and I had bought it 30 years ago as our retirement dream. We'd spent every summer there, reading on the porch, swimming in the lake, planning our golden years together. The idea of Sarah gutting it and turning it into some showpiece made my stomach turn. Then what happened at the lawyer's office? Hugo took a sip of water before continuing. Mr. Peterson started reading the will, and at first everything seemed normal. Small bequests to charities, some personal items for the kids. But then he got to the big stuff, the house, the investments, the savings accounts. And every single thing was left to you. I could picture the scene. My 3 children sitting there, confident smiles slowly fading as they realized their inheritance wasn't coming. Mom's face went completely white. Hugo continued. Uncle Michael started arguing with the lawyer, saying there must be some mistake, that Grandpa had promised them things. Uncle David just sat there with his mouth open. What did the lawyer say? He was really professional about it, but firm. He said the will was very clear and had been updated just 6 months before Grandpa died. Everything goes to you, with one exception. If something happens to you, then it all goes to the grandchildren equally, bypassed the middle generation entirely. That sounded like Harold. He'd always been protective of me, sometimes more than I realized. Even in death, he was looking out for my interests. But then Mr. Peterson pulled out another envelope. Hugo's voice dropped. He said Grandpa had left specific instructions about when to open it. It was only supposed to be opened if there were any disputes about the will or if anyone questioned the legitimacy of family relationships. My heart started pounding again. The DNA test. Right. Mr. Peterson said Grandpa had been concerned about some things he'd overheard at family gatherings. People talking about money, making plans. He wanted to make sure he knew exactly who was really family and who wasn't. I thought back to our last few family dinners before Harold died. He'd been quieter than usual, watching everyone more carefully. I'd assumed it was just the cancer making him tired, but maybe he'd been seeing things I was too trusting to notice. So the lawyer opened the envelope right there? Hugo nodded. The DNA results showed that I'm not biologically related to anyone in that room. Not Mom, not the uncles, not you. And there was a letter from a private investigator Grandpa had hired. A private investigator? Yeah. Apparently, Mom had been lying about my adoption for 15 years. The story she told everyone, that I was the son of some distant cousin who died in a car accident, it was all made up. She got me through an informal adoption from a teenage mother who couldn't keep me. There are no blood ties to your family at all. I sat back in my chair, feeling like I'd been punched. But why would she lie about that? Hugo's laugh was bitter, far too old for his 17 years. Money, Grandma. It's always been about money. Mom figured out early that you and Grandpa were suckers for sob stories, especially ones involving children. So she created the perfect sob story, the orphaned great-nephew who needed a loving home. The pieces started falling into place. All those times Sarah had called asking for help with Hugo's expenses. His school clothes, sports equipment, summer camps, tutoring. I'd written check after check, happy to help my grandson have opportunities. How much do you think they got from us over the years? I asked. The investigator's report had numbers. Just for my expenses alone, school, clothes, activities, medical bills, probably close to $200,000 over 15 years, but that doesn't count all the other stuff. What other stuff? Hugo hesitated, like he was afraid to hurt me more. The times Mom said you were having memory problems and needed help managing your finances. The loans Uncle Michael needed for his business ventures. Uncle David's gambling debts that were supposedly family emergencies. Each revelation was like another weight settling on my chest. They've been planning this for years. Decades, Grandma. Mom used to coach me on what to say when we visited you and Grandpa. How to act grateful. How to mention things I needed. How to make you feel important and generous. I thought it was just normal family stuff until tonight. I looked at this boy. This young man who wasn't my grandson, but who had risked everything to tell me the truth. What happened after the lawyer finished reading? They went crazy. Mom started screaming that there had to be some mistake, that Grandpa was senile when he wrote the will. Uncle Michael was on his phone with his lawyer before we even left the office. Uncle David just kept saying, "This isn't fair," over and over. And you? Hugo met my eyes directly. I sat there thinking about all the times you hugged me and told me you loved me. All the birthday cards with money in them, the Christmas presents you couldn't really afford, the way you always asked about my grades and my friends like you really cared. And I realized that even if we're not blood-related, you've been more of a real grandmother to me than anyone else in that family has been real family. My throat closed up. Hugo. They didn't even notice when I left. They were too busy planning how to contest the will, how to prove Grandpa was incompetent, how to get what they think they deserve. Mom was already talking about hiring her own lawyer. So, you came here. I took the subway and ran the last 8 blocks. I couldn't let them do this to you anymore, Grandma. You've been alone enough. Looking at Hugo across the table, his earnest face still flushed from running through the cold night to find me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not just love, but hope. Maybe real family wasn't about blood after all. Maybe it was about showing up when it mattered. But as I reached across to squeeze his hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's revelations were just the beginning. If my children had been lying about Hugo for 15 years, what else had they been hiding? And more importantly, what else were they willing to do to get their hands on Harold's money? The cab ride to my apartment was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Hugo sat clutching the manila envelope like it contained explosives, which, in a way, I suppose it did. Every few blocks, he'd glance at me with this worried expression, like he was afraid I might suddenly decide he was the enemy too. "You can stay the night," I told him as we pulled up to my building. "We'll figure everything else out tomorrow." He nodded gratefully. Mom's probably wondering where I am by now. Let her wonder. Inside my small apartment, I made tea while Hugo sat at my kitchen table, finally allowing himself to relax. He looked so young in the soft light, too young to carry the weight of secrets he'd been carrying. "How long have you known?" I asked, setting a mug in front of him. "About not being related to us, I mean." Hugo wrapped his hands around the warm cup, staring into the steam. "I've suspected for years, but I only found out for sure tonight. There were always little things that didn't add up." "Like what?" "Medical stuff, mostly. When I was 12, I needed surgery for my appendix. The doctors kept asking about family medical history, and Mom would get this panicked look every time. She'd make up different stories. Sometimes she'd say my biological parents died too young to know their medical histories. Other times she'd claim I inherited certain traits from your side of the family. But her stories never matched up. I thought about all the times I'd looked at Hugo and marveled at how different he was from the rest of us. His dark hair when we were all fair, his height when we were average, his artistic talents when no one else in the family could draw a straight line. And then there was the way she talked about my adoption when she thought I couldn't hear her, Hugo continued. She'd be on the phone with Uncle Michael or Uncle David, and I'd catch fragments of conversations. Things like, "As long as he doesn't find out," or "It's working better than we planned." That must have been terrifying for a child. It was confusing more than scary at first. I didn't understand what they were planning or why it mattered if I found out about my adoption. Lots of kids are adopted, right? But as I got older, I started noticing the pattern. What pattern? Hugo took a sip of tea before answering. "Every time you and Grandpa were generous, every birthday check, every Christmas gift, every time you paid for something I needed, Mom would get this satisfied look, like she'd accomplished something. And she'd always make sure I called to thank you personally, coached me on exactly what to say to make you feel good about helping. My heart ached thinking about this little boy being taught to manipulate people who loved him. Did you understand what was happening?" "Not really. Not until I was older. When I was little, I just thought that's how families worked. But around 13 or 14, I started paying more attention to how Mom talked about money, how she'd time her requests for help, how she'd bring me along when she wanted to ask you and Grandpa for something. She used you as emotional leverage." "Exactly. She'd have me wear my school uniform when we visited if she wanted to talk about tuition costs. She'd make sure I mentioned if I needed new clothes or sports equipment. She'd even coach me to look sad if she was planning to ask for money for some emergency." I set down my teacup harder than I intended, anger rising in my chest. That's despicable. The worst part was that I genuinely loved spending time with you and Grandpa. Those weren't fake feelings, even if the circumstances were orchestrated. You two were the only adults in my life who seemed to care about what I was thinking and feeling, not just what I could do for you. That broke something inside me. This boy had been starved for genuine affection, while being used as a tool for financial manipulation. Hugo, honey, I need you to know that our love for you was never conditional on whether you were biologically related to us. His eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back all evening. I hoped that was true, but I wasn't sure. I've spent years wondering if you'd still care about me if you knew the truth. Well, now you know. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing the enormity of what had been revealed. Then Hugo spoke again, his voice quieter. There's something else I need to tell you about tonight. Something that happened after I left the lawyer's office. What? I didn't go straight to find you. First, I went back to Mom's house to get some of my things. I thought maybe I could avoid the confrontation, just disappear for a while until things calmed down. But they were already there, and they were planning something. My stomach clenched. What kind of planning? They were on conference call with some lawyer Uncle Michael knows. They were discussing how to challenge the will, but not just on the grounds of Grandpa's mental competency. They want to challenge my right to any inheritance as a fraudulent heir. What does that mean? Hugo's hands shook slightly as he set down his teacup. It means they're planning to throw me under the bus to save themselves. They want to argue that because I'm not really family, any gifts or money you and Grandpa gave me over the years were obtained under false pretenses. They think if they can prove fraud, they can void parts of the will. The cruelty of it took my breath away. They're willing to destroy a 17-year-old boy to get their hands on money. It gets worse, Grandma. They were also talking about having you declared incompetent. What? Uncle Michael was saying that your poor judgment in continuing to support me after learning the truth about my adoption could be evidence of diminished mental capacity. They think if they can prove you're not mentally fit to handle your inheritance, they can get themselves appointed as your guardians and control the money that way. I felt like the walls were closing in around me. My own children weren't just willing to steal from me. They were prepared to destroy my autonomy, my dignity, my relationships, anything that stood between them and Harold's money. Did they see you listening? No, I was in my room with the door cracked. But I heard enough to know that they're meeting with the lawyer tomorrow morning to start the process. Mom was talking about finding doctors who would testify about your mental state. Uncle David was researching guardianship laws. And Uncle Michael was already calculating how to divide the inheritance once they get control of it. And what about you? What happens to you in their plan? Hugo's smile was bitter and far too mature for his age. I become the victim they're protecting you from, the con artist who manipulated a poor old woman out of her money. They're planning to paint themselves as the loving children who discovered the fraud and stepped in to save their mother from further exploitation. The beautiful thing about hitting rock bottom, I realized, is that you finally stop being afraid of falling. My children had revealed themselves to be capable of any betrayal, any cruelty, in service of their greed. There was nothing left for them to take from me except my dignity, and I'd be damned if I'd let them have that too. Hugo, I said, my voice steadier than it had been all evening. How would you feel about helping me beat them at their own game? For the first time since he'd burst into the restaurant, Hugo smiled, a real smile, full of hope and determination. I'd feel like finally, someone in this family is fighting back. Good, I said, reaching for Harold's address book, because tomorrow we're going to pay a visit to Mr. Peterson ourselves, and then we're going to that house upstate to see what other surprises Harold might have left for us. What I didn't tell Hugo was that I was already forming a plan that would give my children exactly what they deserved, and it wouldn't require me to sink to their level to do it. Harold had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else. If I knew my husband, this inheritance was just the beginning of the protection he'd built around me. It was time to find out what else he'd been planning. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Hugo was still asleep on my couch, curled up under Harold's old Afghan, looking peaceful for the first time since I'd known him. I made coffee quietly and called Mr. Peterson's office as soon as it opened. Mrs. Holloway, his secretary said warmly, Mr. Peterson was hoping to hear from you. Can you come in this morning? He has some additional documents your husband left with specific instructions about when to release them. More documents. Harold really had been planning for everything. Hugo stirred as I was getting dressed, sitting up and rubbing his eyes like a confused child. For a moment, I could see the little boy he'd been when Sarah first brought him around. Sweet, uncertain, trying so hard to please everyone. How are you feeling? I asked. Like I slept for the first time in years, he said, and I knew exactly what he meant. We took a cab to Mr. Peterson's office, a modest building downtown that had been Harold's lawyer's practice for over 30 years. Peterson himself was probably close to my age, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades helping families navigate their worst moments. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, standing as we entered his office. "And you must be Hugo. Your grandfather spoke about you often." Hugo looked surprised. "He did?" "Oh, yes. He was very concerned about your welfare. In fact, that's part of why we're here today." Mr. Peterson gestured for us to sit. "Your husband left very specific instructions about additional materials to be shared if anyone attempted to challenge the will or questioned family relationships." He pulled out another manila envelope, thicker than the one Hugo had brought me last night. These documents weren't part of the formal will reading because Harold hoped they wouldn't be necessary. "But given what happened yesterday evening with your other children, I think it's time you saw them." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, bank statements, phone records, and what looked like transcripts of conversations. "Harold hired a private investigator 18 months ago," Mr. Peterson explained. "He'd become suspicious about some of the financial requests from your children and wanted to understand what was really happening." The first photograph showed Sarah coming out of a luxury spa, the kind that cost more per visit than most people spent on groceries in a month. The date stamp showed it was taken 3 days after she'd called me crying about being unable to afford Hugo's school supplies. "She told me she was working extra shifts as a nurse to make ends meet," I whispered. The next photo showed Michael at an expensive restaurant, clearly entertaining clients, champagne bottles on the table. The receipt stapled to the back showed a bill for over $800. On the same day, he'd borrowed $3,000 from me for emergency medical expenses. But it was the bank statements that really told the story. Page after page showing deposits from me and Harold, followed immediately by transfers to luxury retailers, vacation resorts, and high-end purchases. None of the money we'd given them for emergencies had gone to emergencies at all. "There's more," Mr. Peterson said gently. "Audio recordings. Harold recorded them? And with their knowledge, actually. He started insisting on putting family meetings on speakerphone, claiming his hearing was getting worse and he needed the volume. What they didn't know was that he was also recording. He handed me a small digital device with earphones. This conversation took place 6 weeks before Harold passed away. Your children had requested a family meeting to discuss your future care needs." I put in the earphones with shaking hands and pressed play. Sarah's voice came through clearly. "Mom's getting more forgetful, Dad. We're worried about her living alone." "She seems fine to me," Harold's voice responded, but I could hear the wariness in his tone. "Well, she wouldn't seem confused to you because you're with her all the time," Michael's voice chimed in. "But when we visit, she repeats herself a lot, forgets conversations we've had." I paused the recording, looking at Mr. Peterson in confusion. "I don't repeat myself. My memory is fine. Keep listening," he said sadly. David's voice. "The thing is, Dad, if something happens to you, we need to make sure Mom is protected. Maybe we should start getting more involved in her finances now, while you're still here to help transition things." "What kind of involvement?" Harold asked. Sarah again. "Just basic stuff. Maybe she could add one of us to her bank accounts, give us power of attorney for emergencies. You know how overwhelming financial decisions can be for women her age." Women her age. I was 67 at the time, not 90. "She's perfectly capable of managing her own affairs," Harold said firmly. "Of course she is right now," Michael responded smoothly. "But we're talking about being proactive, planning ahead. And honestly, Dad, some of the money you two have been spending seems unnecessary." "Like what?" "Well, like all the money on Hugo," David jumped in. "I mean, we love the kid, but he's not even really family. And the amounts you're spending on him could be going toward Mom's long-term care." My blood went cold. Hugo, sitting beside me, had gone completely still. Harold's voice was dangerous now. "Hugo is absolutely family, and what we choose to spend on him is none of your concern." "Dad, be realistic," Sarah said. "He's an adopted kid who's going to be 18 soon and out of our lives anyway. The money you're putting toward his college fund could pay for a really nice assisted living facility for Mom when the time comes. Your mother doesn't need assisted living. Not yet, Michael agreed. But if we start planning now, get the legal framework in place, it'll be so much easier when the time comes. Maybe you should consider updating your will too, making sure everything's set up to protect Mom from having to make difficult decisions alone. The recording went on for another 20 minutes. My children systematically laying out their plan to strip away my autonomy and independence while convincing Harold it was for my own good. They painted a picture of me as a declining, helpless woman who needed their protection from my own poor judgment. What was most chilling was how reasonable they sounded, how they framed every suggestion as being motivated by love and concern. When the recording ended, I sat in silence for a long moment. Mr. Peterson handed me a tissue. "There are 12 more recordings like this," he said. "Each one showing a pattern of your children trying to gain control over your finances, while systematically undermining your competency in your husband's eyes." But Harold saw through it. Completely. He was furious. That's when he hired the investigator and started making plans to protect you. Mr. Peterson pulled out another document. "This is a comprehensive financial analysis of every dollar you and Harold gave your children over the past 15 years. The number at the bottom of the page made me dizzy. $847,000. Almost $1 million, I breathed. Money that was supposed to go toward emergencies, medical bills, education, basic living expenses. The investigator tracked where it actually went. He flipped to another page. Luxury vacations, designer clothes, expensive cars, home renovations, spa treatments, high-end electronics. Your children have been living a lifestyle far above their means, funded entirely by your generosity." Hugo spoke for the first time since we'd arrived. They were never struggling. "Not even close," Mr. Peterson confirmed. "And they've been planning this inheritance grab for years. The investigator found email chains between your children dating back 5 years, discussing how to manage Mom and Dad's money better and planning how to divide assets." He handed me one more document. "This is the most important one. It's a detailed plan Harold created for what would happen if your children attempted to challenge his will or question your mental competency." The document was titled Protection Protocol for Della Holloway, and it was 15 pages of the most thorough legal planning I'd ever seen. Harold had anticipated every move my children might make and created countermeasures for each one. "He's given you multiple ways to protect yourself," Mr. Peterson explained. "Legal, financial, and even personal safety measures. But the most important thing is this." He pointed to a clause near the end. "Any heir who challenges the will or attempts to have you declared incompetent automatically forfeits any claim to the estate, and their portion goes directly to you. So if they try to fight this, they lose everything." Harold made sure of that. He also set up a trust that becomes active if anyone tries to challenge your mental competency. It immediately places all assets under the control of an independent trustee until the challenges are resolved. I looked at Hugo, who was reading over my shoulder, his eyes wide with amazement. "Your grandfather really did think of everything," Mr. Peterson said. "But there's one more thing. He left you a letter to be opened only after you'd seen all this evidence. He handed me a sealed envelope with Harold's handwriting, 'For my beloved Della, when you're ready to fight back.' As I tore open the envelope, I realized that Harold hadn't just left me an inheritance. He'd left me the tools to reclaim my life and protect the people who truly mattered. Like the young man sitting beside me, who'd risked everything to tell me the truth. My children thought they were 3 steps ahead, but Harold had been playing a completely different game. And now it was my turn to make the next move. The drive to the upstate house took 2 hours, Hugo and I mostly silent as we wound through the familiar roads Harold and I had traveled together for 3 decades. Every curve brought back memories. The first time we'd seen the property, the summers we'd spent renovating it ourselves, the quiet evenings on the porch watching the sunset over the lake. I'd read Harold's letter twice before we left Mr. Peterson's office, and I was still processing his words. The man I'd lived with for 45 years had known things about our children that I'd been too trusting to see. But more than that, he'd loved me enough to spend his final months building a fortress around me. "Are you nervous?" Hugo asked as we turned into the long gravel driveway. I don't think nervous is the right word, I said, looking at the house rising before us. I think I'm ready. The house looked exactly as we'd left it the weekend before Harold's diagnosis. Same blue shutters, same wraparound porch, same flower boxes that would need planting soon. But knowing it was truly mine now, that Harold had made sure of it, changed everything about how it felt. Hugo helped me with the key Mr. Peterson had given us, not the old key we'd always used, but a new one Harold had apparently had made. Inside, the house smelled like the lavender sachets I'd left in all the drawers, mixed with the faint scent of the wood polish Harold had always insisted on using. It's beautiful, Grandma, Hugo said, looking around the main room with its stone fireplace and walls lined with books. I can see why Mom wanted to renovate it. Your mother wanted to gut it, I corrected. She always said it was too old-fashioned, too small, too quiet. She wanted to turn it into some kind of showplace. I walked through the rooms slowly, remembering. The kitchen where Harold and I had cooked together every morning. The reading nook where we'd spent rainy afternoons. The bedroom where we'd planned our retirement dreams. But it was in Harold's study that I found what he'd left for me. The room looked normal at first glance. His desk still covered with the crossword puzzles he'd never finished. His reading glasses still folded on top of a half-read biography. But there was an envelope on his desk that hadn't been there before. My name written in his careful handwriting. This is it, I whispered, my hands shaking as I picked it up. Hugo stood quietly in the doorway as I sat in Harold's chair and opened the envelope. Inside were 3 sheets of his cream-colored stationery, covered with the writing I knew as well as my own. My dearest Della, it began, and I had to stop reading for a moment to compose myself. If you're reading this, it means our children have shown you who they really are, and you've finally seen what I've been seeing for years. I'm sorry, my love. I'm sorry you had to discover their true nature this way, and I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this pain while I was still with you. But I want you to know that every decision I made about our estate, every precaution I took, every document I had prepared, all of it was done out of love for you. Not anger at them, though God knows I was angry. Love for you, and determination that you would never be at their mercy. I know you think you failed as a mother. You've said it to me so many times over the years, especially after particularly difficult encounters with Sarah, Michael, or David. You've blamed yourself for their selfishness, their entitlement, their coldness toward you. But Della, sweetheart, you didn't fail. They did. You gave them everything a parent should give: love, support, guidance, opportunities. You sacrificed your own dreams to help them achieve theirs. You worked extra shifts to pay for their educations, went without things you wanted so they could have what they needed, and you never once made them feel guilty for the burden. The problem was never your love, Della. The problem was that they learned to see your love as weakness, your generosity as something they were entitled to, your forgiveness as permission to hurt you again. I watched it happen gradually over the years. Each time you bailed them out of financial trouble they'd created themselves. Each time you forgave them for missing important events in your life. Each time you made excuses for their behavior to other people. They learned that there were no consequences for treating you badly, so they kept pushing further. I should have intervened sooner. I should have insisted we stop enabling them years ago. But I knew how much you loved them, and I couldn't bear to be the one to make you choose between your husband and your children. So I stayed quiet and watched them break your heart over and over again. But when they started talking about managing your finances and questioning your mental competency, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. The things they said about you when they thought I wasn't listening, the way they talked about you like you were already gone, like you were an obstacle to their inheritance rather than their mother, it made me realize they were capable of anything. So I made my plans, not to punish them, though they deserve punishment. I made my plans to protect you. Every dollar I left you is yours to do with as you choose. Every legal protection I put in place is there to ensure your independence. Every piece of evidence I gathered is there to defend you if they try to paint you as incompetent. But more than that, Della, I wanted to make sure you understood something. You are not responsible for their choices. You are not obligated to sacrifice your peace for their greed. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. The woman I married 45 years ago was strong, independent, and capable of anything she set her mind to. The only thing that changed over the years was that you let other people convince you otherwise. But that woman is still there, my love. She's been waiting for permission to stand up for herself. Consider this letter your permission. Hugo is a good boy, Della. I know he's not our biological grandson, but he's shown more loyalty and love to our family than our own children ever have. If you choose to keep him in your life, you have my complete support. If he chooses to stay with you instead of them, I think you'll both be better for it. I've left some additional funds in a separate account for his education. Not because he's entitled to it by blood, but because he's earned it by being the kind of person our actual grandchildren never learned to be. The account information is in the safe behind my diploma. The combination is your birthday. There's also something else in the safe that I want you to have. It's a deed to the lot next to this house. I bought it 5 years ago, thinking we might want to build a guest cottage someday. I never told you because I wanted it to be a surprise for our 50th anniversary. We won't make it to 50 years together, but I want you to have it anyway. Build something beautiful there, Della. Build something that's entirely yours. The children will try to come back into your life once they realize they can't break the will. They'll apologize, make promises, swear they've changed. They'll use whatever emotional leverage they think will work. Guilt about breaking up the family, concern for your health, claims that they were just trying to protect you. Don't believe them. People who are capable of the level of manipulation and betrayal they've shown you don't change just because their plans fail. They'll be back for the same reason they've always been there. Because they want something from you. But you don't owe them anything anymore, my love. You've already given them more than any parent should have to give. The rest of your life is yours to live however you choose. I hope you choose to be happy. I hope you choose to travel to all those places we talked about visiting. I hope you choose to spoil yourself the way you spent your whole life spoiling everyone else. I hope you choose to surround yourself only with people who love you for who you are, not what you can give them. And I hope you know, every single day, how much you were loved, not just by me, though I loved you more than I ever found words to express, but by everyone whose life you touched with your kindness, your generosity, your enormous heart. You are enough, Della. You have always been enough, and you deserve every good thing life has to offer. All my love, always and forever, Harold P.S. The wine cellar has been restocked with that Bordeaux you love. I may be gone, but I'm still taking care of you. By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of feeling truly seen and loved for the first time in years. Hugo had quietly entered the room and was sitting in the chair across from the desk, his own eyes wet with tears. "He really loved you," he said softly. "He really did." I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest. And he was right about everything. I looked around Harold's study, at the safe behind his diploma, at the windows overlooking the property that was now truly mine. For the first time since his death, I felt Harold's presence not as a loss, but as a gift. He was still protecting me, still guiding me, still loving me. And he'd given me everything I needed to finally stand up for myself. "Come on," I said to Hugo, standing up with more energy than I'd felt in months. "Let's see what else your grandfather left us. But first, I had some phone calls to make. 3 phone calls, actually, to 3 people who were about to learn that their mother was not the weak, manipulable woman they thought she was. It was time to show them exactly who they'd been dealing with all these years. 6 months later, I stood on the porch of the lake house watching Hugo graduate from the local high school. He'd transferred for his senior year, claiming he wanted a fresh start, but I knew the real reason. He wanted to stay with me, and I wanted him to stay too. The guest cottage Harold had dreamed of was almost finished, rising from the lot next to the main house like something out of a fairy tale. Hugo had designed it himself. He'd always been artistic, though his mother had never encouraged that side of him. It would be his space when he left for college in the fall, but also his home base for whenever he wanted to come back, because this was home now, for both of us. The phone calls I'd made that day in Harold's study had been brief and final. 3 conversations that ended 40 years of being taken for granted, manipulated, and treated like an ATM instead of a mother. Sarah had cried, of course. Tears had always been her favorite weapon. Mom, you can't be serious. We're family. Families forgive each other. You're right, I'd told her. Families do forgive each other, but they also treat each other with respect, and you stopped doing that years ago. But what about Hugo? You can't just steal my son. I'm not stealing anyone. Hugo is 17 years old enough to choose where he wants to live. And he's chosen to stay with the person who actually loves him. Michael had tried anger instead of tears. This is ridiculous, Mom. You're letting that kid poison you against your own children. Can't you see what he's doing? What I see, I'd replied, is a young man who's shown me more honesty and loyalty in one day than you've shown me in years. What I see is someone who came to find me when I was alone and heartbroken, instead of plotting with lawyers about how to steal my inheritance. We weren't plotting. We were trying to protect you. From what, Michael? From having enough money to take care of myself? From making my own decisions? From being happy? No, you were trying to protect yourselves from the possibility that I might spend my own money instead of hoarding it for you. David had been the most honest, probably because he'd always been the worst liar. Look, Mom, maybe we handled things wrong, but we're still your kids. You can't just cut us off. I can, I'd said, and I am. You made your choice when you decided to lie to me, steal from me, and plan to have me declared incompetent. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. In the months that followed, they'd tried everything. Flowers, cards, showing up at the house unannounced. Sarah had even brought Emma once, thinking that seeing my granddaughter would weaken my resolve. But I'd learned something important from Harold's letter. I wasn't responsible for fixing relationships that other people had broken. Hugo thrived in ways I'd never seen before. Without the constant pressure of being the perfect manipulative tool, he'd blossomed into the remarkable young man he'd always been underneath. He was funny, thoughtful, creative, and surprisingly wise for his age. He'd been accepted to art school with a partial scholarship, and Harold's education fund would cover the rest. But more than that, he'd become the family I'd always wanted. Someone who asked about my day because he cared about the answer. Someone who remembered things that were important to me. Someone who hugged me just because, not because he wanted something. The cottage was his graduation gift, but also my gift to myself. For the first time in my life, I'd built something that was mine from the ground up. Something that would exist exactly as I wanted it to exist. Grandma Della! Hugo called from the yard where he was adjusting the new porch furniture we'd picked out together. Mrs. Henderson is here. Mrs. Henderson was our closest neighbor, a widow around my age who'd become a dear friend over the past few months. She was the first person I'd told about Harold's letter, and she'd cried right along with me. Della, she said, climbing the porch steps with a wrapped package in her hands. I brought Hugo a graduation gift. You didn't have to do that, Margaret. Of course I did. He's family. Family. The word meant something different now than it had a year ago. Family wasn't just people who shared your blood. It was people who showed up for you, who chose to love you, who treated you with respect and kindness. Hugo opened Margaret's gift. Art supplies, expensive ones that he'd been admiring in the art store in town but would never have asked for. His face lit up in a way that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this boy who wasn't my grandson, but felt more like my grandson than any blood relative ever had. This is too much, he said, but Margaret waved him off. Nonsense. You're going to be a famous artist someday, and I want to be able to say I knew you when. We spent the evening on the porch, the three of us, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink. Hugo sketched while Margaret and I talked about our gardens, our books, our quiet, peaceful lives. Just as the sun disappeared behind the trees, a car pulled into the driveway. My stomach clenched automatically. 6 months of peace had trained me to be suspicious of unexpected visitors. But it was just Dr. Morrison from town, making his weekly check on Margaret's blood pressure medication. He'd become another unexpected addition to our little chosen family, often staying for dinner after his house calls, bringing stories from his practice, and a dry sense of humor that reminded me of Harold. "How's our graduate?" he asked Hugo, settling into the fourth porch chair we'd added just for him. "Officially done with high school as of this morning," Hugo grinned. and officially terrified about college. Good, Dr. Morrison said. Being a little scared means you're paying attention. As the evening wore on, our little group grew. Tom from the hardware store stopped by to drop off the mailbox Hugo had ordered for the cottage, custom made with his initials and a small painted design. Jenny from the bookstore brought a bottle of wine to celebrate Hugo's graduation and ended up staying for dinner. This was my life now. Not the grand social circle my children had always thought I should want, but something better. A community of people who genuinely cared about each other, who showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Around 10 o'clock, as our impromptu party was winding down, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. After months of ignoring calls from my children, it had become habit. But the number was unfamiliar, so I picked up. Mrs. Holloway, this is Amanda Peterson, James Peterson's daughter. I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted to let you know that we executed the final part of your husband's instructions today. Mr. Peterson had passed away 2 months ago, and his daughter had taken over his practice. She'd been handling the last details of Harold's estate planning. What instructions? The charitable donations. Your husband set up a fund to be distributed to local charities 6 months after the will was finalized, assuming there were no successful challenges to its terms. Since your children's legal challenges were dismissed, we were able to distribute the funds today. How much? $200,000, Mrs. Holloway, split between the Children's Hospital, the Women's Shelter, and the literacy program at the library. Your husband left specific instructions that the donations be made in your name. In my name. Even in death, Harold was making sure people knew that I was a woman of substance, a woman who gave back to her community, a woman worthy of respect. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, watching Hugo help Margaret down the porch steps to Dr. Morrison's car. Jenny was packing up leftover cake to take home to her teenage daughter. Tom was telling some elaborate story that had everyone laughing. This was Harold's final gift to me. Not just the money or the house or the legal protections, but the permission to build a life that made me happy. Permission to stop trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it, and to accept love from people who offered it freely. Hugo came back up onto the porch and sat in the chair next to mine. Good day? He asked. The best, I said, and meant it. Grandma Della, he said quietly. I know I'm not really your grandson. I know the DNA test proved that. But you're the realest family I've ever had. I reached over and took his hand. This young man who'd risked everything to tell me the truth, who'd chosen me when choosing me cost him everything else he'd known. Hugo, I said, blood doesn't make family. Love makes family. Choice makes family. Showing up makes family. And you've been more family to me than anyone else in my life. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars reflect on the lake, listening to the peaceful sounds of the night. Tomorrow, Hugo would start packing for college. In the fall, I'd drive him to school and help him move into his dorm room, just like any proud grandmother would do. And when he came home for holidays, it would be to this house, to this life we'd built together, to this family we'd chosen. My children would probably keep trying to come back into my life. They'd probably show up at holidays, claim they'd changed, try to guilt me into forgiveness. But I had Harold's letter in my dresser drawer, and I read it whenever I needed reminding of who I was and what I deserved. I deserved peace. I deserved respect. I deserved to be loved for who I was, not what I could provide. And sitting here on this porch, surrounded by people who saw me clearly and loved me anyway, I finally had all three. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a mirror. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was exactly as Harold had planned it to be. And for the first time in years, I was exactly who I was meant to be. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.